Have you ever noticed how the loudest message you can send doesn't even require words? Sometimes silence is the sharpest truth, and when a super empath goes quiet, it can completely unravel the avoidance ego. When you're deeply empathetic, you give, you understand, you listen, you meet people where they are, even when they're guarded, even when they're pulling away. But here's the paradox, the very thing that makes an avoidant feel safe at first. Your compassion and patience can also make them take it for granted. They assume the empath will always be there, waiting, holding space. And then silence. When a super empath chooses silence, it's not out of cruelty. It's out of self-preservation. It's the moment they decide, my peace matters more than chasing your walls. This silence doesn't scream. It doesn't beg. It simply reflects back to the avoidant everything they've been running from, their fear of intimacy, their patterns of pushing away, their illusion of control. Silence becomes the mirror. And in that mirror, the avoidant sees the one thing they cannot stand to face, themselves. That's why the empath's silence doesn't just sting. It destroys the ego the avoidant has carefully built, brick by brick, to keep love at arm's length. Silence is often mistaken for weakness or for giving up. But in truth, when an empath becomes silent, it is one of the most powerful statements they can ever make. An empath spends much of their time giving attention, giving emotional support, giving validation. They read between the lines, they pick up on the subtle shifts in tone. They sense the hidden emotions that others try so hard to bury. Because of this gift, they are often the ones to hold the emotional weight in a relationship, especially with someone who leans avoidant. The avoidant pulls back, shuts down, or creates distance, and the empath steps in, trying to bridge the gap with understanding and love. For a while, this feels balanced because the empath is fulfilled by giving and the avoidant feels safer by keeping their space. But eventually, this pattern turns heavy. The empath realizes they're doing all the emotional labor and their efforts are being met with silence or indifference. At that moment, the empath's silence is not absence. It's a boundary. It says without words, I will not keep pouring into a space where nothing flows back. This silence is not punishment, not manipulation, it's clarity. It's the empath recognizing that love should not feel like one person constantly chasing while the other keeps running. By choosing silence, the empath protects their own energy. They stop feeding into the cycle of push and pull that the avoidant depends on to maintain control. Instead of trying to decode the avoidant's mixed signals, they let the silence speak for them. And in that silence, the avoidant feels something they're not used to, the absence of the empath's steady, unconditional presence. For the avoidant, this silence is disorienting. They've built their entire relational identity on the belief that they can retreat whenever intimacy feels threatening, and the empath will still be there, waiting with open arms. But when the empath sets that boundary, the dynamic flips. The avoidant is no longer the one deciding the pace of closeness. They can no longer rely on distance as their shield because the empath is no longer reaching out to close the gap. Silence reveals the reality that the avoidant has no control over someone else's presence. They can withdraw, but they cannot force the empath to keep showing up. And this is where the ego begins to crack. What makes this silence powerful is its purity. It carries no resentment, no long speeches, no dramatic exit. It's simply space, clean, firm, undeniable space. The empath steps back, not to hurt, but to heal themselves. And in doing so, they redefine the rules of the connection. The avoidant is left to sit with the very emptiness they've been running toward. For perhaps the first time, they feel the cost of their avoidance. And all of it was communicated without a single word, because silence in the hands of an empath is not emptiness, it's strength, it's self-respect, and it's the clearest boundary they can ever set. The avoidant thrives on a subtle kind of power dynamic. Their pattern is predictable. The moment intimacy feels too close or vulnerable, they pull back. This withdrawal is not always loud or obvious. Sometimes it looks like delayed replies, avoiding eye contact, shutting down emotionally, or creating physical distance. The underlying message is clear. I'm retreating, and if you want connection, you'll have to come find me. This strategy works well with most people because the silence, the withdrawal, triggers insecurity. It makes the other person chase, ask questions, seek reassurance, and fight to bring closeness back. For the avoidant, that response feels like confirmation that they still hold control. They don't have to risk exposure or intimacy because someone else is doing the work of bridging the distance. But when the empath chooses silence, the script breaks. The avoidant pulls away, expecting pursuit, but the pursuit never comes. They wait for the familiar pattern, the texts, the emotional check-ins, the heartfelt explanations, the desperate attempts to understand what's wrong. Yet nothing arrives. The empath, who once stepped in to repair every rupture, has stepped back instead. That silence is not just the absence of words, it's the absence of compliance with the avoidance rules. The game of push and pull is no longer being played. Suddenly, the avoidant loses the very power they relied on to feel secure in distance. For someone who avoids closeness, control is everything. They often believe they can dictate when intimacy happens and when it doesn't, as if the other person will always adapt to their rhythm. But the empath's silence dismantles this illusion. By not chasing, by not reacting, the empath demonstrates that they cannot be controlled by distance. They reveal that connection cannot be sustained on one person's terms alone. This loss of power strikes at the avoidant's ego because it challenges their deepest assumption that they can push people away without consequence, and those people will still remain loyal, patient, and available. When the empath chooses not to chase, the avoidant feels something foreign, uncertainty. For the first time, they are not the one creating the rules of engagement. They are not the one deciding how much closeness or distance exists. The empath's silence makes them realize that relationships are not one-sided playgrounds where they can withdraw at will and expect unconditional acceptance. The power imbalance they depended on collapses, and in its place is a stark truth: control only exists if the other person agrees to play along. This is where silence becomes a quiet rebellion. It flips the script in the simplest way possible. The avoidant, who once felt strong in their ability to withdraw, now feels powerless because their withdrawal no longer has the desired effect. The silence removes the fuel that keeps their cycle alive. Without pursuit, the game ends. And when the game ends, the avoidant has no choice but to face themselves, their behavior, their fears, and the possibility that the connection they took for granted might not always be their waiting. Silence has a way of stripping away illusions. Words can be twisted, debated, or brushed aside, but silence sits like a mirror, reflecting back what is already there. When a super empath stops speaking, they remove the distractions that the avoidant has relied on. There are no explanations, no soothing reassurances, no comforting tones to soften the tension. What remains is a stillness that forces truth to the surface. For the avoidant, this truth is often uncomfortable. They are left alone with their own thoughts, their own fears, and the reality that the distance they created has consequences. An avoidant often thrives in the grey areas of relationships. They depend on ambiguity. When the empath speaks, it is easy for them to dodge, deflect, or reinterpret the meaning of what's being said. They can argue about words, turn the focus back on the empath, or minimize the issue altogether. But silence offers no such escape. It cannot be debated, it cannot be dismissed, and it cannot be redirected. Silence leaves the avoidant to face with the very emotions they've been avoiding: fear of abandonment, fear of not being enough, fear of true intimacy. The empath's silence is not empty, it is full. Full of all the things that were once said, repeated, explained, and overlooked. Full of unmet needs that can no longer be ignored. It carries weight because it comes after a history of effort. The empath was once the one who filled the space with love, understanding, and patience. They spoke the words of reassurance, they offered the safety net, they explained again and again what they needed and what they felt. So when silence finally arrives, it echoes louder than any argument could. It is not just the absence of sound, it is the absence of excuses left to hide behind. For the avoidant, this silence becomes a spotlight. It shines on the very patterns they thought they could escape. They feel the emptiness of conversations that no longer happen, the absence of check-ins that once gave them security, the missing warmth that once made their distance tolerable. Instead of comfort, they are met with a void. And in that void, their ego begins to crumble. The silence reveals that their walls do not protect them, they isolate them. The very defenses that were meant to keep them safe now leave them standing alone. Silence exposes truth, not by forcing it, but by allowing it to surface naturally. It removes the noise and the constant motion that distracts from reality. When the empath is quiet, the avoidant is left with no one to project onto, no one to chase them, no one to take responsibility for the connection. The only presence in that silence is their own. And in that presence, the truth they've been avoiding becomes unavoidable. Their fear has cost them closeness. Their control has cost them love, and their walls have built nothing but emptiness. The avoidant personality is built around the idea of control. By deciding when to engage and when to retreat, they convince themselves they are the ones who set the terms of intimacy. They lean on distance as their shield, believing that if they step back far enough, they cannot be hurt, and no one can demand more from them than they are willing to give. This illusion of control becomes their comfort zone. They tell themselves they can always return when they want to, that the other person will still be there, waiting. It is a fragile belief, but it allows them to keep love at arm's length without fully losing it. When the empath chooses silence, that illusion begins to crumble. The avoidant pulls away, expecting the empath to rush forward and restore the connection. But instead of pursuit, they meet stillness. That stillness carries a message. The avoidant cannot ignore control, does not rest solely in their hands. Connection is not something one person dictates. It is a two-way flow, and without the empath's participation, the avoidance retreat loses its power. For the first time, they realize their withdrawal is not a strategy. It is a gamble. They cannot simply step back and expect closeness to remain untouched, because silence has made it clear that love cannot survive without reciprocity. The dismantling of this illusion strikes the ego at its core. The avoidant has relied on the belief that they hold the upper hand. By keeping emotional distance, they have felt secure, convinced they could manage both independence and connection on their terms. But silence strips away that fantasy. It shows them that the other person is not under their control. The empath has the power to step back too, and when they do, the avoidant sees that their grip on the relationship was never as strong as they thought. This realization brings discomfort, even fear. Suddenly, the avoidant is forced to confront the reality that love cannot be dictated, only shared. They begin to see that closeness requires vulnerability, not manipulation. The silence reveals that their attempts to orchestrate connection through withdrawal have backfired. Instead of keeping them safe, it has left them powerless. The more they tried to control intimacy, the more they have lost it. For the empath, silence is liberation. For the avoidant, it is disarmament, their usual tools. Distancing, detachment, emotional coldness no longer work when the other person refuses to play along. The walls they built for control have become cages, trapping them in isolation rather than protecting them from pain. The silence holds up that mirror, showing them that control was never real, only an illusion they clung to out of fear. And now, without words, without effort, the empath has shattered that illusion by simply refusing to engage in the old pattern. In that quiet space, the avoidant sees the truth they never had the power they believed they did, because real connection has always required two. When an empath finally chooses silence, what they are really choosing is themselves. For so long, they have poured energy into holding a connection together, often at the expense of their own well-being. They have listened, they have soothed, they have explained, and they have made endless allowances for the avoidance patterns of retreat. It is second nature for the empath to try to understand, to bridge the distance, and to keep the relationship alive even when it feels one-sided. But silence marks a shift. It is the moment when the empath decides that their self-worth is no longer tied to someone else's willingness to engage. By withdrawing their words, they reclaim the energy they once gave so freely. And in doing so, they remind themselves of their own value. For the empath, silence is not about punishment. It is about preservation. It is the refusal to keep giving when there is no balance. It is the recognition that love cannot thrive if it is always flowing in only one direction. Each time the avoidant withdrew, the empath filled the space with reassurance. Each time the avoidant created distance, the empath closed the gap. But when that cycle repeats enough times, it becomes clear that the empath's worth is being overlooked. Silence, then, becomes the declaration that they will no longer allow their kindness to be exploited or their patience to be mistaken for weakness. In that quiet, the empath begins to feel their own strength. They realize they do not need constant communication to validate who they are. They do not need the avoidant's presence to confirm their significance. The silence creates room for them to hear themselves again, to remember that their empathy is a gift, but it is not a gift to be wasted. They begin to see that their value was never in how much they could endure or how well they could accommodate someone else's fears. Their value has always been inherent, and their silence is a way of honoring it. For the avoidant, this silence is unsettling because it disrupts the dynamic they relied on. They are used to being chased, to being reassured, to being met with endless understanding. But when the empath no longer fills that role, the avoidant is left with the reality that they cannot take the other person's devotion for granted. The silence communicates more powerfully than words ever could. I know my worth, and I will not spend it on someone who does not meet me halfway. In this way, silence is the empath's greatest act of self-respect. It is a boundary that needs no explanation. It says that love must be mutual, that reciprocity is non-negotiable. And while it may feel heavy at first, the silence becomes liberating. The empath discovers that they are not defined by the avoidant's ability to connect. They are defined by their own choice to honor themselves, even if that choice means walking away from someone who cannot meet them where they stand. In that moment, silence is not just the absence of words, it is the voice of self-worth finally being heard. And so, what begins as silence is never just emptiness. It is a boundary, it is the end of a power game, it is truth revealed, it is the collapse of illusion, and it is the reclaiming of self-worth. The super empath doesn't need to raise their voice, argue, or demand recognition. Their quiet withdrawal speaks louder than anything they could ever say. It teaches the avoidant that love is not unconditional access, that connection cannot be dictated by fear, and that intimacy cannot survive without reciprocity. The silence is powerful not because it hurts, but because it heals. It heals the empath by restoring their energy, by reminding them of their own strength, and by setting a standard that they will no longer accept less than they deserve. And for the avoidant, it becomes the moment of reckoning. The ego cracks, the control fades, and the truth can no longer be ignored. Love only thrives when two people choose to meet each other, not when one endlessly gives while the other hides. So if you've ever been the empath in this story, let this be your reminder. Your silence is not weakness. It is your declaration that your heart, your energy, and your presence are valuable. And if you've ever been the avoidant, see the silence not as rejection, but as an invitation to grow, to face your fears, and to learn how to give back what you've always been given. Thank you for sharing this space with me, for listening, and for reflecting on these truths. I hope you leave with a deeper understanding of yourself and the power you hold when you choose to honor your worth. Until next time, take care of your heart, honor your boundaries, and never underestimate the strength found in silence.